Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to the Attic. I've been asked by my patrons to make a video showing examples of sexual depravity in the Bible. So I've gone away and I found 25 such examples. And because I typically get criticized for doing a lengthy disclaimer at the beginning of these videos, I'm just going to jump into the first example and try and do my disclaimer as I go along. So example number 1 is from Genesis 9, verse 21. It's one that always confused me when I was a believer in the Bible as God's inerrant word. I'm now an atheist, so it's less confusing. But Genesis 9:21, describing Noah, says in the New International Version, when he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. New Living Translation, one day he drank some wine he had made and he became drunk and lay naked inside his tent. English Standard Version, he drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Decide for yourselves, viewers, whether there's anything weird going on here. All I would say is that either Noah got drunk or he didn't. Whether he is clothed or unclothed, when he is in the privacy of his own tent, is surely not something that we need to be kept informed of by the writers of this verse. It sounds like something's happening here that's a little bit weird or gross or of a sexual nature, and the writers are trying to skim over it, at least in the way it's been rendered in modern translations. So make of that what you will. We'll now go to example number 2, which is where Abraham shares his wife, Sarah. Let's read it, shall we? From the New International Version. This time, I'm not using the New World Translation because I'm bored of viewers complaining that I'm reading from the Jehovah's Witness Bible. So this time, I'm reading, in all but one case, straight from a scholarly, accepted, standard version of the Bible. So Genesis 12:10-20. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. When Abraham came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? He said, why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So what's being described here is Abram giving his wife to Pharaoh, or if you want to describe it another way, allowing his wife to be captured by Pharaoh, because it's not like Sarai was hitting on Pharaoh and trying to get herself into his bed or anything. Pharaoh orders for Sarai to be brought to him, and Abram does this apparently so that he can acquire sheep and cattle. So it's kind of a transaction. Sarai or Sarah is used in a sexual way so that Abram can acquire goods, acquire cattle and commodities, and even, as we see there, male and female servants. So there's even a bit of slavery laced in there. And in the case of female servants, I'm sure, yet more sexual depravity. Anyway, let's move on to example number 3. Sarai shares Abraham. It goes both ways. There's a real kind of swinging element to Abram and Sarah's relationship, as we see in Genesis 16, verses 3 to 4. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. So Abram's giving away Sarai, or Sarah. It's confusing, isn't it? And Sarai's sort of giving away Abram by giving him another sexual partner. And this is all apparently totally fine to God, who allowed all this to be included in his word to mankind, his book that we're supposed to turn to as a moral authority. Example number 4, still with Abraham and Sarah. I'm not going to look up the verse. I'm just going to give you the verses here on the screen in the caption. But if you compare Genesis 17, 15, and 16 with Genesis 20, verses 11 and 12, it's obvious that God encourages or commands the relationship between Abraham and Sarah. He wants them to have progeny. He wants them to be part of his divine purpose. Their union is important to him. And yet it's acknowledged in Genesis 20 and in other places in Genesis that Sarah is Abraham's sister. So basically what you have in the whole Abraham-Sarah story, apart from all the wife swapping and swinging that's going on, is incest. Example number 5, and this is where it starts to get dark. And spoiler alert, a lot of these examples, this is what I would have said in the disclaimer, a lot of these examples that I'm giving you are extremely dark and extremely disturbing. And for the purposes of keeping my YouTube audience happy, and specifically YouTube happy, I can't really go into too much detail in my commentary, even though I would like to. But it's just there in the Bible. And whether God approves of what's being described in the Bible or not, it's still sexual depravity. And bear in mind that, especially in Christian fundamentalist groups, children are encouraged to read this stuff. And it's disturbing even for adults to read some of this stuff. Case in point, Genesis 19, verses 4 to 8. I'm reading here again from the New International Version. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends." My friends? "Don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." So my guests, who up to this point are total strangers to me, are more important because they're men. Please feel free to have at it with my daughters. They're all yours. That's apparently the sort of attitude that Lot had. And bear in mind that it was Lot and his daughters who were saved out of Sodom and Gomorrah because they were considered righteous. Staying in Genesis 19, for example, number 6, let's check out what happens in verses 30 to 36. Lot and his 2 daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. You know what? It would be funny if we could have some romantic music at this point, Tibor. So, cue the music. One day, the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father to drink wine, and then sleep with him, and preserve our family line through our father." That night they got their father to drink wine, and the older daughter went in and slept with him. He was not aware of it when she lay down, or when she got up. The next day the older daughter said to the younger, "Last night I slept with my father. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight, and you go in and sleep with him so we can preserve our family line through our father." So they got their father to drink wine that night also, and the younger daughter went in and slept with him. Again, he was not aware of it when she lay down, or when she got up. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. Again, just for, and the music there. Thank you, Tibor. Again, we're talking about a story in the Bible in which 2 girls are having sex with their dad, so it's incest. And these are apparently the sole survivors of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is happening a short while after Lot's wife has been turned to a pillar of salt for the crime of looking in the wrong direction. And yet, apparently, it's perfectly okay for Lot's daughters to shag him. Example number 7 is yet more debauchery going on in Abraham and Sarah's relationship, their weird thing that they've got going on, brother-sister thing. It's actually in Genesis 20, verses 1 to 7, and I would encourage you to read it. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read it now. But suffice to say, Abraham shares his wife through surreptitious means with a ruler named Abimelech. And for example, number 8, let's go to Genesis 20, verses 17 and 18, where God uses infertility as a punishment. So we'll read from the New Living Translation. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants, so they could have children. For the Lord had caused all the women to be infertile because of what happened with Abraham's wife, Sarah. This is all kinds of messed up as far as I'm concerned. So there's not only swinging going on, there's not only Abraham sharing out his wife so that he can get material gains, he can get cattle and produce, and I think Abimelech offers him some land. He offers him 1,000 pieces of silver. So Sarah is essentially being prostituted out for cash. And what does that say about the role of women in the Bible if they're just commodities that can be passed around in that way? But it's messed up for me that God punished Abimelech and Abimelech's wife and female servants. And one of the ways he punished them was in a sexual way. He interfered with their reproductive systems so that they couldn't conceive children, which, if you think about it, is kind of sexual violence in a way, or sexual abuse being used by God, weaponized as a form of punishment. For example, number 9, we have the story of Laban and Jacob. Again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read it, but you can if you want to, in Genesis 29, verses 21 to 28. Basically, it's where Laban tricks Jacob into having sex with Leah instead of Rachel, which was the agreement. Again, women are kind of bartering tools in this situation. They're commodities that can be traded, in this case, for work. And it's a little bit weird when you're reading the account because it mentions Zilpah as being Leah's servant. So Jacob is expecting Rachel. Laban tricks him into instead having sex with Leah. And the verse specifically mentions, and he also brought into the tent Zilpah, who was Leah's servant. So this is the tent where the action's happening on the wedding night, and you have to wonder why it mentions Zilpah if Zilpah wasn't also being included in some sexual way in what was already a very messed up situation. For example, number 10, I've chosen Genesis 34, or the story of Dinah, which is quite a disturbing story that I won't be going into in too much detail. Suffice to say, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, who is connected to the previous messed up, sexually deprived example, Dinah, the daughter of Leah and Jacob, gets raped. And in retribution, there's a whole lot of extra violence meted out against women. So if you scroll down to verses 25 to 29, it says, 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword and took Dinah from Shechem's house and left. The sons of Jacob came upon the dead bodies and looted the city where their sister had been defiled. So it wasn't just about retribution for their sister being defiled. They were also profiting from it by looting. And then it says in verse 28, they seized their flocks and herds and donkeys and everything else of theirs in the city and out in the fields. They carried off all their wealth and all their women and children, taking as plunder everything in the houses. So they kill all the men, they loot the city, but what they're interested in keeping in terms of keeping people alive are the women and children. So as retribution for one woman being raped, it seems multiple women are raped or enslaved. Again, there's no indication that God approves of all of this, that this is one of many examples I'm going to be giving you where God seems to be just watching it all happen, arms folded, without making any particular judgment one way or the other. But how messed up that all of this is in a book that is lauded as a moral authority, and that children all over the world are expected to read and learn from. For example, number 11, I invite you to read Genesis 35, verse 22, which tells the story of Reuben having sex with his father's concubine. For example, number 12, I invite you to read Genesis 38, verses 15 and 16, which tells of Judah having sex with his daughter-in-law. Example number 13 is another really chilling one, and you'll understand why when we turn to Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 and 29. Again, we're reading from the New International Version. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. So, whereas in other examples, we're just hearing these messed up stories of sexual depravity, and there's no clear indication as to whether God approves or disapproves. It's just a story that we're supposed to derive some kind of moral guidance from. In this case, however, this is a direct command from God. This is part of God's law. This is God's standard. God thinks it is a moral thing, apparently, for a woman who is raped to be forced into marriage with her rapist. Example number 14 is a bit of an odd one. It seems on the surface to not be describing something sexual, at least if we read from scholarly versions of the Bible, in other words, not the New World Translation. The New International Version renders Numbers 25, verse 8, he, that's Phinehas, drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped. So it's describing Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, exacting righteous judgment and ending this immorality that's happening on the part of the Israelites. And at least as far as the New International Version is concerned, a spear gets driven into someone and into a woman's stomach, which on the surface doesn't sound like it might be sexual. But then when you consult the Douay version, here's how it renders the same verse. Went in after the Israelite into the brothel house and thrust both of them through together, to wit, the man and the woman in the genital parts, and the scourge ceased from the children of Israel. So apparently Phinehas insisted on not just executing a man and a woman who were in the act of, it seems, having sex, not just killing them there and then. Apparently there was a sadistic element to the killing because they were killed in the genital parts. And that's how the same verse is rendered in the New World Translation, the doctored version of the Bible that's used by Jehovah's Witnesses, where it says, it renders the same verse, then he went after the man of Israel into the tent and pierced both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her genital parts. At that, the scourge on the Israelites was halted. So this, for me, if we're at least relying on the Douay version or the New World Translation, is describing sexual violence. Example number 15 doesn't get any better, I'm afraid, when it comes to how messed up and sadistic it is. We're going to turn to Numbers 31, verses 13 to 18, and we're going to keep it in the New International Version. So Numbers 31, 13 to 18, Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the community went to meet them outside the camp. Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, who returned from the battle. Have you allowed all the women to live? He asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. So Moses is ordering his soldiers to kill all men and kill all non-virgins and save the virgin women, the virgin girls, for themselves. I should just add, perhaps by way of lightening the mood, that we have no reason to believe that any of this actually happened. If you consult what scholars have to say about the Bible and its origins, there is no historical evidence for any of the events of the Exodus from Egypt or the conquest of Canaan or the exploits of the Israelites right up to the times of David or Solomon. There's no evidence to suggest that any of that happened outside of the Bible. And you would think there would be some. I mean, you would think there'd be evidence supporting there being a people in Egypt who are captive and there being plagues that hit the Egyptians and these people leaving Egypt and trekking across the wilderness and there being loads of battles and lots of bloodshed and a conquest. You would think there would be some evidence of this, but there isn't. So if you're feeling really disturbed, rightly so, by how messed up these stories are in the Old Testament, well, fortunately, we're in a part of the Bible that archaeology just simply doesn't support. These are basically myths. They are messed up myths. But until some kind of archaeological evidence is found to support any of these stories, we can essentially dismiss the idea of any of these things actually having happened. Example 16, Samson, the Bible hero, has sex with a prostitute. That's described for you in Judges 16 verse 1, if you want to check that out. Example 17 is a really chilling narrative. Again, thankfully, we have no evidence that it actually happened, but it's a really chilling narrative of the gang rape of a concubine. And that's in Judges 19, verses 22 to 29. Connected with that narrative is example number 18. As part of the aftermath of what happened to the concubine and the whole chain of events that set off, we read again in the New International Version, Judges 21, verse 11, "This is what you are to do," they said, "kill every male and every woman who is not a virgin." They found among the people living in Jabesh-Gilead 400 young women who had never slept with a man, and they took them to the camp at Shiloh in Canaan. Then the whole assembly sent an offer of peace to the Benjamites at the rock of Rimmon. So the Benjamites returned at that time and were given the women of Jabesh-Gilead who had been spared. But there were not enough for all of them. So again, all the men are killed and all the women are killed who have already had sex, who are not virgins. And the virgins are spared so that they can be given as spoils of war. Nice bedtime reading, isn't it, if you're a child growing up in a Christian fundamentalist family. Example 19, I'm afraid, also describes sexual violence towards women in the context of war. We're again reading from the New International Version, this time Judges 21, verses 19 to 23. "But look, there is the annual festival of the Lord in Shiloh, which lies north of Bethel, east of the road that goes from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Labonah." So they instructed the Benjamites, saying, "Go and hide in the vineyards and watch. When the young women of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, rush from the vineyards, and each of you seize one of them to be your wife. Then return to the land of Benjamin. When their fathers or brothers complain to us, we will say to them, Do us the favor of helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war. You will not be guilty of breaking your oath, because you did not give your daughters to them. So that is what the Benjamites did. While the young women were dancing, each man caught one and carried her off to be his wife. Then they returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and settled in them. So, as spoils of war, women are assaulted, they are pounced on, and carried off. Am I the only one who's starting to build a picture of all of this having been written by men, extremely backwards men, rather than some all-wise, all-loving, all-benevolent God? Example number 20 is another story of sexual violence, but this time towards men. 200 Philistine foreskins are paid as dowry by David, according to 1 Samuel 18, verses 20 to 30. Sounds reasonable. Staying with David, for example 21, you might want to check out 2 Samuel 6, verse 20, where it describes David uncovering himself publicly. Again, I suppose you'll have to decide for yourself, as with the Noah story, quite what uncovering means. Sounds like he exposed himself, I don't know. Example number 22, David has sex with Bathsheba. We're all familiar, I'm sure, with that story. David commits adultery with a woman, and in order to try and cover up the adultery, he tries to have the woman's husband killed by putting him on the front line in battle, which is what ends up happening. And interestingly, the punishment for David is that the baby that is the product of the infidelity, of the act of adultery, is killed. So God's a baby killer. That is the story that we read in 2 Samuel, and the act of infidelity itself is 2 Samuel 11, verse 4. But moving on to example number 23. Again, this is one that you can look up yourself. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read it. But it describes Amnon raping his sister. So that's 2 Samuel 13, verses 11 to 14. Example number 24 is that of Absalom having rooftop sex with his father's concubines. So that's 2 Samuel 16, verse 22. And for our 25th and final example of sexual depravity in God's Word, the Bible, we're going to go to Isaiah 13, verses 9 to 16, where it describes the day of the Lord. See, and we're reading again from the New International Version for clarity. See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty, and will humble the pride of the ruthless. I will make people scarcer than pure gold, more rare than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord Almighty, in the day of his burning anger. Like a hunted gazelle, like sheep without a shepherd, they will all return to their own people. They will flee to their native land. Whoever is captured will be thrust through. All who are caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be looted, and their wives violated. This is apparently God's plan for the day of the Lord, when justice will be served. Anyway, those were my 25 examples of sexual depravity from the Bible. Apologies if so many of them were dark, again, we can kind of console ourselves in knowing that history doesn't back up practically all of these stories. There's no actual historical evidence that any of these things happened. It seems that, at least in the vast majority of cases, if not all the cases, these are just the dark, twisted, perverse thoughts of the writers of the Bible. And again, doesn't it really show in a glaringly obvious way that the writers of the Bible were backward men living in a backward age when women were treated as commodities and could be used for bartering and could be violated as spoils of war, even in the context of wars that were sanctioned somehow by God when it came to the conquest of Canaan, or whatever war God thought it was worthwhile for the Israelites to wage on his behalf. Anyway, I hope you found this information useful. Thanks again to my patrons and YouTube channel members for asking me to cover this topic. Don't forget that you can watch similar videos by subscribing to the Lloyd Evans channel, but that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching.